Another Teamster official was gunned down last week. As John Miller tells us, it's just one in a series of gangland-style murders.
Police were called to the scene by a tow truck operator who found two bodies slumped in the backseat of a late-model car.
Unsolved, very public executions by an underworld that plays by their own rules and their own code of justice.
The ability of the mob to kill people in cold blood and get away with it gives them the ability to terrorize other people.
Let's get out of here. Come on.
Despite all the movies, American organized crime remains a mystery for most of us. Despite the best effort of the police, some things that went down continue to puzzle us to this day. Here is our countdown of the biggest mob mysteries in history. Number 5. The Valentines Day Massacre. On February 14, 1929, 7 people were brutally murdered in a Chicago garage shooting. It was 10:30 in the morning when 2 men wearing police uniforms approached the garage, accompanied by 2 more men in suits and ties. Members of Chicago's North Side gang had gathered at the location in the neighborhood of Lincoln Park when the gunmen ordered them to line up against a wall and opened fire. Using shotguns and machine guns, the unknown killers fired hundreds of rounds before fleeing the scene. The massacre was one of the worst to ever occur in Chicago's history, and almost certainly were a result of the competition over the city's lucrative bootlegging trade.
A man who lived nearby walked over and pushed open the door to the garage. The floor was covered in mutilated bodies.
The predominantly Irish North Side mob had been competing with Al Capone's Chicago outfit, with both making millions selling illegal booze.
I think when people hear the name Al Capone, the first thing that comes to mind is Tommy guns, bodies falling, blood spilling from corpses.
Several high-ranking members of the North Side mob were murdered in the attack, including the gang's second-in-command Albert Kachelik and the gang's bookkeeper Albert Weinshank. The perpetrators of the massacre have never been conclusively identified, but many suspect it was members of Egan's Rats, a violent gang that may have been hired by Al Capone to eliminate his competition.
Gangster Al Capone was in Florida that day and never charged, but many believe he was the mastermind behind the killings.
Another theory is that members of the Chicago Police Department carried out the attack, who allegedly wanted revenge for the murder of an officer's son not long before. On arrival at the scene, officers found one victim, Frank Gusenberg, was still alive. He had been shot 14 times and was rushed to hospital where doctors managed to briefly stabilize him. When police asked who carried out the attack, he replied, "I won't talk for God's sake, just get me to a hospital." He died 3 hours later, taking the names of the killers to his grave. Number 4. What happened to Jimmy Hoffa? Jimmy Hoffa was an American trade union leader and convicted criminal who disappeared on July 30, 1975. Hoffa became involved with the unions from an early age and eventually rose to the ranks as president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in 1957.
And jubilant Jimmy Hoffa sweeps in as new president of the Teamsters.
As leader of the union, Hoffa greatly expanded its membership and improved conditions for thousands of truck drivers across the country. However, his career was far from clean, and trucker unions were heavily influenced by organized crime at the time.
Only Jimmy Hoffa can rejoice at his continued good luck. Honest union members and the general public can only regard it as a tragedy.
In order to expand and unify trucking unions, Hoffa was required to make arrangements with many organized crime syndicates. As the union grew, so did the influence of the mob. He first faced criminal charges in 1957 when he was arrested for allegedly trying to bribe a select committee aide. Despite avoiding conviction, the arrest triggered a series of investigations that finally ended in a jail sentence in 1964. He was found guilty of jury tampering, bribery, conspiracy, and fraud. He began serving a 13-year sentence in 1967, but was released after just 5 years.
I stand here today before you as I stood in front of that court and took an oath that I was not then guilty, nor am I guilty now.
He tried to regain his position in the union, but faced fierce opposition from every corner, including the Mafia. Tony Provenzano was one boss who didn't like Hoffa. They had disagreements while spending time in prison together, but Hoffa asked for the gangsters' support in rebuilding his union career anyway.
And you think that amongst the rank and file, you're still number one?
I would say there's no problem.
Several of Provenzano's opponents in the union had already been murdered or assaulted, so Hoffa must have been aware of the risks. A peace meeting was set up between Hoffa and Provenzano on July 30th, 1975, at the Machus Red Fox restaurant in Detroit. Hoffa arrived at the meeting spot, but called his wife in frustration after the mobsters failed to arrive. He was seen entering a vehicle not long after with 3 other men, and was never seen again.
We have faith that someone, somehow, somewhere, can help us locate our father.
It is widely believed that the Mafia had ordered Hoffa's murder. However, no individuals have ever been charged in relation to the case, as key details remain missing. Hoffa's body has also never been discovered. Digs have been occasionally carried out in the last few years looking for Hoffa's remains, but many believe that the truth will never be known. Number 3. Who killed Bugsy Seagull? Bugsy Seagull was an American mobster who was responsible for much of the development of the Las Vegas Strip. He was influential in the Jewish mob alongside his childhood friend and gangster Meyer Lanksy. He was also influential in the transition to multi-ethnic criminal organization that emerged at this time. Before Seagull and his contemporaries, the organization of criminal activity was strictly segregated.
You had very strict divisions between the various ethnic gangs. Jews didn't even go into Italian neighborhoods. Italians didn't even go into Jewish neighborhoods, much less cooperate on crime.
Seagull had friends in the Italian-American Mafia and the National Crime Syndicate, and utilized brutality and violence to build a reputation as an enforcer. Described as handsome and charismatic, Seagull was one of the first front-page celebrity gangsters. He was known as a founder of the enforcement organization Murder, Inc., and worked as a hitman and muscle for various organizations. Known for his use of guns and violence, he was tried for the murder of former friend and informant Harry Greenberg in 1941, but managed to avoid prison time. On the night of June 20th, 1947, Seagull visited his friend and associate Alan Smiley at a mutual friend's home. The two friends were chatting when an unknown sniper fired into the room, hitting Seagull several times. Smiley dived to the floor and survived, but the same could not be said for his friend. Seagull had been hit 4 times, including twice in the head. He was pronounced dead at the scene.
Bugsy Seagull, the gangster responsible for creating the glitzy Las Vegas we know today, now lies in a pool of his own blood.
The reason for Seagull's murder remains a topic of debate. One theory is that he was overspending and potentially stealing from the mob. Another theory is that he was shot preemptively by Matthew Panza at the request of his lover, B. B was the wife of Mo Sedway, a gangster who Seagull had reportedly threatened to kill not long before. In a desperate attempt to save her husband, B may have asked her lover to murder Seagull. At present, both of these theories are unproven, and no one was ever convicted of the murder. Number 2. Was Black Dahlia killed by the mob?
There's a local resident who's walking in the early morning hours about 10 o'clock with a toddler, and she sees something that looks like a mannequin in an open field.
Mannequin that appears to be broken in half. She thinks it's a prank.
Bersinger recalls, quote, "I glanced to my right and saw this very dead white body. My goodness, it was so white. It didn't look like anything more than perhaps an artificial model. It was so white and separated in the middle."
On January 15, 1947, the mutilated body of a young woman was discovered in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. Her case became highly publicized due to the gruesome nature of her death. Her body was found cut in half and severely mutilated. The woman's name was Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old waitress who had moved to California from Boston to live with her father. Despite describing herself as an aspiring actress, there was no evidence of her pursuing it as a career at the time of her death. She had several jobs while in California, moving around the state extensively during the war. In 1943, she moved out of her father's home after arguments made cohabitation impossible. She was also arrested for underage drinking that year, but avoided trouble other than that. After briefly moving to Florida and falling in love with a pilot, she returned to California after the war, spending the last 6 months of her life living on Hollywood Boulevard. On January 9, 1947, Short returned to LA after a brief trip to San Diego with Robert Manley, a 25-year-old married man whom she had been seeing. Manley stated that he dropped Short off, who told him she would be seeing her sister that day. Some staff claimed to have seen her using the lobby telephone that day, which was one of the last times she was seen alive. The mutilation of her body was so severe that it caused a media frenzy. Short's face had been slashed from mouth to ear on both sides. Her body had been sliced open in numerous locations, and her intestines had been tucked beneath her buttocks.
They actually investigated 300 medical students at USC to find out if one of them had done it.
Several letters claiming responsibility were also discovered by police, which only added to the local hysteria. Despite no one ever being convicted for the murder, some have suggested that her death was somehow connected to the Mafia. It has been alleged that Short had been in a relationship with newspaper publisher Norman Chandler. After she got pregnant, some believe Chandler contacted infamous hitman Bugsy Seagull to kill Short. This theory, like all the others based around Short's death, were built entirely on hunches rather than any hard evidence. The murder remains one of the most infamous cold cases in American murder history. Did Elizabeth really lose her life as as a result of becoming pregnant? Was the Mafia involved in her brutal killing? We may never know. Number 1. Lanskys Millions. Lansky was an influential developer of the National Crime Syndicate who became known as the mob's accountant. A member of the Jewish mob, Lansky was instrumental in the running of a vast multinational gambling empire. As well as his work for the Jewish mob, he was also heavily involved with the Italian-American Mafia and other crime organizations overseas. Using his excellent knowledge of gambling odds and business administration, Lansky was able to earn millions through illegal gambling.
Mr. Lansky, what does the name Jewish Mafia mean to you?
You know, I never heard that until I read it in the Israeli newspapers. Why, it's most ridiculous.
Despite a 50-year career in organized crime, he was never found guilty of anything more serious than illegal gambling. Lansky died of lung cancer in 1983.
When some newspaper man wrote an article that I have $300 million. Well, I wish I had $1 million.
He worked with infamous mobsters, Lucky Luciano and Bugsy Seagull, who earned millions through bootlegging, gambling, and drug trafficking. He also invested in casinos in Cuba, Las Vegas, the Bahamas, and London. So, what happened to all of Lansky's money? Many have suggested that Lanskys millions are still sitting out there somewhere, tucked away in hidden bank accounts, or buried in a safe somewhere. Others believe that Lansky probably lost it all after a couple of sequential misfortunes in the 50s. It's well known that his investments in the Caribbean ended up being financially devastating for him after the Cuban Revolution and a government bribery scandal in the Bahamas. The Cuban Revolution changed everything. Lansky was forced to flee Cuba in 1959, and many of his casinos were looted. Did he simply lose his massive fortune before his death, or did Lansky's millions end up in someone else's hands? Despite denying to have ever possessed a massive fortune, it seems unlikely that Lansky would have been anything other than filthy rich. We hope you enjoyed our countdown of some of the biggest mysteries in Mafia history. Which mystery was the most confusing for you? Do you think you have the answers to any of them? Are there any we missed out on? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and thanks for watching Crime 101.